What could make the richest rancher in Wyoming choose the one woman an entire town treated like she didn't belong? In the frozen winter of 1887, a powerful ranch owner shocked Red Hollow. When he turned away the wealthy women everyone admired and chose a quiet native woman and nobody wanted. The town called it madness. His father called it betrayal. But no one knew that the woman they mocked would soon uncover secrets buried beneath the ranch itself. Secrets powerful enough to destroy families, ignite war, and change the future of the entire valley forever. And it all began in the night he looked at her and truly saw her. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Now let's begin the story. The winter of 1887 settled over Red Hollow, like a curse that refused to lift. Snow buried the rooftops in thick, white layers, and the wind howled through the narrow streets, hard enough to rattle wooden signs outside the saloons and supply stores. Horses stamped nervously beside frozen hitching posts, while smoke climbed from chimneys into a gray Wyoming sky that looked cold enough to crack. Red Hollow was rich by frontier standards. Cattle money flowed through the banks the rail investors visited often, and the Bennett Ranch controlled more land than some towns back east. But beneath the wealth lived another truth, quieter and uglier. The white families controlled everything that mattered in the sheriff's office, the freight routes, the whiskey trade, the cattle auctions, and beyond the edge of town, near the frozen banks of Black Creek, the Lakota families lived in weather-beaten cabins and patched tents as if they belonged to another world entirely. Ayanna Red Elk had spent her whole life learning how invisible a person could become while standing right in front of everyone. At 24, she carried herself with the quiet endurance of someone much older. Her hands were rough from stitching leather and hauling water through snowstorms. Old scars crossed her fingers from sewing needles, knives, and years of repairing broken tack for men who rarely bothered to thank her. Every morning before sunrise, she worked beside the weak fire inside the tiny cabin she shared with her grandmother, boiling herbs or stitching ripped coats while icy winds slipped through cracks in the walls. Her grandmother coughed often now. Winter always made it worse. "You should rest," Ayanna whispered one morning while wrapping a faded blanket around the old woman's shoulders. "And let you carry the whole world alone," her grandmother rasped softly. "No, child." Ayanna smiled faintly, though exhaustion sat heavy behind her eyes. She spent her days moving between the town and the Lakota settlement, trading herbs for flour washing clothes for cowboys, mending saddles, and treating lame horses that white ranchers suddenly valued more than their prejudice whenever an animal stopped working. Nobody in Red Hollow called her by her name unless they needed something. Most simply called her the native woman no one wanted, not wanted as a wife, not wanted as a permanent worker, not wanted in town unless her labor became useful. Men who mocked her heritage still brought injured horses to her because they knew she could calm animals faster than most ranch hands. Women who refused to sit near her at church still paid her to sew winter blankets. Ayanna endured all of it in silence because survival left little room for pride. Across the valley, Bennett Ranch prepared for a very different future. The Bennett estate stood above Red Hollow, like a kingdom carved into the Wyoming hills. Endless fences stretched across snow-covered land. Hundreds of cattle moved like dark shadows through the white plains. Cowboys rode patrol even in freezing wind because losing livestock during winter could ruin an entire season. Walter Bennett ruled it all. Tall, hard-faced, and feared by nearly everyone in town, Walter had built Bennett Ranch into the most powerful operation in the territory. He expected obedience from his workers, respect from the town, and absolute loyalty from his sons, especially from Cole Bennett. Walter had already decided exactly how the future would unfold. Cole would marry Clara Whitmore, daughter of one of the wealthiest families in Red Hollow. The marriage would secure railroad investments, strengthen political ties, and opened the path toward expanding into Northern Valley. To Walter, it was perfect business. To the town, it looked like destiny. Clara Whitmore will make a fine Mrs. Bennet, people whispered constantly. Clara certainly looked the part. Beautiful dresses, soft hands, perfect posture. She played piano beautifully and smiled exactly the way wealthy men liked wealthy women to smile. But Cole Bennet felt nothing when he looked at her. One freezing afternoon, Red Hollow's main street overflowed with wagons, traders, and ranch hands gathering for market day. News had already spread that Cole Bennet would formally court Clara that evening, and half the town buzzed with excitement over the future alliance. Then chaos exploded without warning. A stallion pulling a supply wagon suddenly screamed and reared high into the air. Its eyes rolled white with panic as the wagon tilted sideways. Wooden crates crashed into the street. One wheel snapped violently against the frozen ground. People scattered instantly. "Move, get back." The horse kicked wildly, breaking part of the harness, while the driver lost control entirely. Then a child fell directly into the middle of the road. For one terrible second, nobody moved. Cowboys hesitated, unsure whether to rush the horse or save the boy. The stallion struck the ground again, maddened by noise and fear. And then Ayanna ran forward. Someone shouted at her to stop, but she ignored it completely. Instead of grabbing the reins violently like the others tried to do, she pulled off her coat and moved slowly toward the horse, shielding part of its vision. Her voice rose low and calm in Lakota, steady as falling snow. "Easy. Easy now." The stallion jerked again, nostrils flaring. Ayanna stepped closer. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The horse's breathing slowly eased. Its wild movements softened just enough. That was all the opening she needed. She lunged forward, grabbed the terrified child, and rolled clear moments before the broken wagon collapsed where the boy had been lying. The street went silent. Ayanna handed the crying child back to his mother. Instead of gratitude, the woman pulled the boy away quickly and whispered harshly, "Don't let someone like her touch you again." The words landed harder than the cold. Ayanna lowered her eyes and stepped back as if she had expected nothing different. Across the street, Cole Bennet stared at her. Not with disgust, not with pity, with recognition. Because while the rest of the town froze in fear, she had been the only person willing to move. That evening, Cole rode to Whitmore House beneath lantern-lit snow. Edward Whitmore welcomed him with a broad smile and expensive whiskey, while Helen Whitmore fussed proudly over every detail in the parlor. Clara entered gracefully in a pale cream dress, her golden hair pinned carefully beneath pearls. She played piano beautifully. She laughed at the right moments. She spoke about dances back east, elegant hotels in Denver, and the social events she hoped to host once she became Mrs. Bennet. Walter sat nearby, looking deeply satisfied. But the longer Cole listened, the heavier something settled in his chest. When conversation finally turned toward ranch life, Clara's smile weakened slightly. "Oh, I simply cannot stand the smell of livestock," she admitted with a nervous laugh. "Though I suppose I'll grow used to it eventually." Walter chuckled. Cole remained silent. "And winter calving?" he asked eventually. "You know what that's like?" Clara blinked. "Not exactly. 3 days without sleep during blizzards. Pulling calves from dying mothers while your hands freeze to the ropes." Clara stared at him uncertainly. "Well," she said softly, "that's what ranch hands are for, isn't it?" Walter's expression darkened instantly at the tension in his son's face. Cole looked away, because suddenly all he could think about was another woman standing calmly in the middle of a terrified horse, while wealthy townspeople screamed from safety. As he left Whitmore House later that night, he heard metal tools clinking behind the stable. Ayanna sat beneath a hanging lantern repairing a torn saddle for a cowboy too cheap to replace it. Snow drifted around her boots, while her red cracked fingers moved carefully through thick leather. "You missed a stitch there," the cowboy muttered. Ayanna quietly tightened the seam without argument and handed the saddle back. Cole noticed the precision in her work immediately. The way she checked the leather grain, the way nervous horses calmed when she stepped near them. One restless gelding tossed its head sharply in the nearby stall. Ayanna walked over and rested one hand gently against its neck. The horse relaxed almost instantly, and in that moment, Cole realized something terrifyingly simple. She belonged to this land in a way Clara never could. 3 nights later, Red Hollow Hall blazed with candlelight. The wealthiest families in town filled the ballroom. Ranchers drank whiskey beside railroad investors, while women in expensive gowns whispered excitedly about the future Bennett marriage. Everyone believed they already knew how the night would end. Clara stood beside her parents, wearing ivory silk, looking every bit the future queen of Red Hollow. Walter raised his glass proudly. "To the future of Bennett Ranch," he declared. Applause filled the room. Near the entrance, Ayanna quietly stepped inside, carrying repaired leather tack for one of the ranch hands. She intended to leave immediately after delivering it. But several women noticed her. She should have used the back entrance. What is she even doing here? Ayanna ignored them the way she ignored most cruelty. Then Walter turned toward Cole with a satisfied smile. The room quieted instantly. Clara's eyes shimmered with expectation. Cole stepped forward, toward Clara, toward the future everyone had chosen for him. And then he walked past her completely. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Cole stopped directly in front of Ayanna. She stared at him in disbelief, still holding the worn leather bag in her hands. "I don't need a woman who only understands ballrooms and parlors," Cole said clearly. "I need someone who understands this land, someone who knows hardship, someone who can survive beside me instead of hiding behind me." The silence became suffocating. Then someone whispered loudly, "He's choosing the Indian girl." Walter Bennett's face turned pale with fury. Clara looked shattered. But Ayanna did not smile. She looked at Cole as though he had just placed a dangerous burden directly into her hands. "I'm asking you to marry me," Cole said. Ayanna's eyes hardened immediately. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because you truly see me? Or because you want to hurt your father?" The question struck harder than a slap. Cole held her gaze. "Because you're stronger than anyone in this room." Ayanna shook her head slowly. "All my life," she said, "people used me when they needed something. Then they threw me away afterward. I won't become another weapon for a rich man's rebellion." And before the entire town of Red Hollow, she refused him. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. Walter immediately seized the moment. "You embarrass yourself for a woman who doesn't even know her place," he snapped at Cole. Clara burst into tears. Edward Whitmore looked ready to explode. But Ayanna walked out alone beneath the hatred of nearly every person in the room. Cole did not chase her. Instead, he stayed and endured every insult thrown at him, proving he would not leave her carrying the consequences alone. That same night, he rode through snow toward the Lakota settlement beside Black Creek. Men watched him carefully from the shadows as he approached Ayanna's cabin. Ayanna stepped outside immediately, anger flashing in her dark eyes. "You should not be here. I know. You brought every eye in town onto me. I know that too." Cole asked to speak with her grandmother. The old woman studied him silently beside the fire before finally speaking. "Men with your name took this land," she said. "Now you come asking for my granddaughter." Cole listened without interrupting. If you choose Ayanna, the old woman continued, you choose every wound this town gave her, every insult, every hatred, every piece of pain carried by your own family name. Cole nodded slowly. I can't undo everything my family did, he admitted. But I can choose not to become another man who looks away. For the first time, Ayanna saw something different in him. Not ownership, not pity, respect. The next morning she rode to Bennett Ranch herself. If I agree, she told him firmly, it is not because I need saving. You don't. I will still care for my grandmother. I will still work. And if you use me only to fight your father, I'll leave. Cole accepted every condition without hesitation. By sunset, all of Red Hollow knew. And by nightfall, the town no longer called it a romance. They called it a scandal. The backlash came immediately. Store owners refused service to Lakota workers connected to Bennett Ranch. Rumors spread through saloons that Ayanna had bewitched Cole with Lakota magic. Railroad investors suddenly hesitated about future partnerships. Walter Bennett openly demanded his son cancel the engagement. Cole refused. If people only respect this ranch when I obey their prejudice, he said coldly, then their respect means nothing. The divide between father and son became impossible to hide. The wedding happened quickly beneath a gray winter sky. No grand celebration, no music, no blessing from the town. Only a reluctant minister, Ethan Bennett, standing quietly beside his brother, Ayanna's grandmother, wrapped in heavy blankets and a handful of curious ranch hands, watching from a distance. Walter Bennett did not attend. Neither did most of Red Hollow. Clara watched from across the road, tears burning in her eyes, as Cole placed a simple ring onto Ayanna's hand. Afterward, Cole brought his new wife to Bennett Ranch. The main house rose before them, huge, elegant, and cold as stone. Walter stood waiting at the entrance. He never called her daughter-in-law. A Lakota woman does not belong inside this house, he said flatly. Cole stepped forward instantly. She's my wife. She can stay, Walter replied. But she stays in the workers' shack. The humiliation was deliberate. Every ranch hand understood it immediately. Ayanna did too. For one brief second, silence hung between them, while snow drifted across the yard. Then, Ayanna picked up her own small bag before Cole could touch it. Without begging, without arguing, without lowering her eyes. She walked alone toward the tiny workers' shack near the edge of the property, while cowboys watched from the barn doors. She'll run by the end of the week, one muttered. 3 days, another laughed. Ayanna heard every word, but she never looked back. Do you think Ayanna will survive a ranch where almost everyone wants her gone? Or will the pressure finally break her? And was Cole brave for choosing the woman no one wanted, or did he just start a war that could destroy them both? Tell us what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of their story. The first morning, Ayanna woke at Bennett Ranch, and the sky outside the workers' shack was still black. The cold had crept through every crack in the wooden walls during the night, leaving frost along the edge of her blanket. Before the sun rose, the ranch bell echoed across the valley. Work had already begun. Ayanna pushed herself upright quietly, pulling on the same faded work dress she had worn before marrying Cole Bennett. Nothing about the room around her looked like the home of a rancher's wife. The shack smelled of smoke-damp wood and old leather. A single lantern sat beside the bed. Her few belongings remained folded neatly in one corner. She stepped outside, carrying a bucket toward the water pump. Several ranch hands stood near the barn, drinking coffee. Their conversation lowered the moment they saw her. "Well, look at that," one cowboy muttered loudly. "Mrs. Bennett fetchin' water like the rest of us." The others laughed. Another tipped his hat mockingly. "Mornin', Mrs. Bennett." the words sounded less like respect and more like a dare. Ayanna continued walking without answering. Walter Bennett crossed the yard moments later in his heavy coat and gloves. His eyes passed over her like she was another fence post standing in the snow. "This ranch doesn't need a Lakota bride," he announced to the men nearby. "It needs obedience." Silence followed. Everyone waited for Ayanna to react. She didn't. She understood the trap already. If she fought back, they would call her savage. If she stayed silent, they would call her weak. So she chose something else. She went to work. Later that morning, Cole found her carrying feed sacks toward the stables. "You shouldn't be doing this out here," he said. "Come into the main house." Ayanna shook her head. "Not today. My father's trying to humiliate you." "I know. Then why let him?" She adjusted the sack on her shoulder. "Because if I walk into that house on the first morning, every man here will believe I survived because you protected me." Her eyes met his steadily. "If I'm going to live here, I need to stand on my own feet." Cole looked frustrated, but he finally nodded. For the first time, he realized strength did not always look like fighting back loudly. Sometimes it looked like enduring without bending. By the end of the week, the quiet sabotage began. Walter never gave direct orders against her. He didn't need to. The ranch hands understood perfectly what kind of woman their boss hated. One afternoon, a cowboy named Reed tossed her stable tools toward the far end of the barn. "Stall 12 needs cleaning," he said casually. "Watch yourself. Devil doesn't like strangers." Devil was the most violent horse on Bennett Ranch. The stallion slammed against the wooden walls the moment Ayanna approached. Foam dripped from its mouth. One eye carried a cloudy scar from an old injury. Several men waited nearby pretending to work while secretly expecting her to get kicked across the barn. Ayanna stepped closer slowly. The horse lunged once, then stopped. She noticed the old whip scars across its shoulder immediately. Someone had beaten this animal hard for years. Instead of forcing her way inside, she leaned against the stall quietly and waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Snow blew through the cracks in the barn walls while the men gradually lost interest and wandered away. Only Sam Carter remained. The older foreman watched silently as Ayanna finally entered the stall and rested her hand against the horse's neck. Devil lowered his head. Sam narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. "She's either brave," he muttered under his breath, "or she actually understands horses." The next sabotage came 2 days later. Ayanna was preparing a saddle for one of the ranch mares when her fingers paused along the leather strap. A tiny cut, almost invisible. Someone had sliced through the saddle strap halfway. One hard ride would have snapped it completely. She said nothing. Instead, she repaired the damage carefully, later hung the cut strap on a hook outside the stable where everyone could see it. No accusations, no scene, just proof. The ranch hands exchanged uneasy looks as they passed by. She knew. And worse, she had stayed calm. That unsettled them more than anger would have. At dinner that night, Walter decided to humiliate her personally. The ranch hands sat shoulder to shoulder at the long wooden tables inside the bunkhouse, steam rising from bowls of stew. Ayanna sat quietly near the end beside Cole. Walter entered mid-meal. The entire room stiffened. "Well," now Walter said loudly, removing his gloves. Has the new wife learned how to hold a fork properly? Yet several men laughed nervously. Ayanna kept eating. Walter's eyes hardened slightly at being ignored. "You can wear a Bennett ring all you want," he continued, "but you'll never carry Bennett blood." Cole shoved his chair back sharply. "That's enough." Walter turned toward him immediately. "You'd throw away this family's reputation for a woman who doesn't belong here." Cole stepped forward, fury rising fast. But Ayanna touched his hand beneath the table. The movement stopped him. Later outside in the freezing dark, Cole confronted her beside the worker shack. "You should have let me answer him." "And start another war?" she asked quietly. "He insulted you. He wanted you angry." Cole clenched his jaw. "You shouldn't have to endure that alone." Ayanna looked toward the distant lights of the main house. "I don't need you fighting every battle for me." Her voice softened slightly. "I need you to believe I can survive them." The words stayed with him long after she closed the shack door. Not everyone at Bennett Ranch hated her. Ethan Bennett became curious first. Unlike Walter, Ethan watched people carefully before judging them. He noticed Ayanna never tried acting like a wealthy ranch wife. She never complained, never begged for approval. One afternoon, he found her repairing tack outside the stable. "Why do you talk to horses in Lakota?" he asked awkwardly. Without looking up, Ayanna answered, "Horses don't care what language you speak. Then why does it work?" She finally glanced at him. "Because they hear fear before words." Ethan considered that carefully. Over the next several days, he kept returning with more questions. How could she predict storms from clouds? Why did birds fly low before snow? How did trackers follow trails after wind-erased footprints? Ayanna answered. Simply never treating him like a child. Walter noticed quickly. "Stay away from her," he warned Ethan one morning. Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully, but later that same evening, he returned to the stables anyway. Then, the blizzard came. The storm rolled across Wyoming without warning late one afternoon. Winds screamed across the valley, hard enough to shake barn doors from their hinges. Snow swallowed the northern trail within minutes. Ethan rode out before sunset to inspect fencing near the ridge. He never returned. By nightfall, panic spread through Bennett Ranch. Walter organized search parties immediately, but visibility had nearly vanished. "We wait till morning," one ranch hand argued. "Men'll die out there tonight." Ayanna listened quietly while they described Ethan's route. Then she spoke. "The wind shifted west after sunset," she said. "If his horse slipped, the snow would bury the main trail first." Walter scoffed. "And what would you know about that?" She ignored him. "You won't find him following the road. Watch for broken snow shelves and crow movement." "That sounds like Indian superstition," Walter snapped. Cole hesitated. For one dangerous moment, he stood between his father's authority and Ayanna's instincts. Ayanna solved the decision herself. She grabbed rope blankets and a lantern before heading toward the stable. Cole caught her arm. "You can't ride into that storm alone. Then come with me." Sam Carter stepped forward next. "I'll go." The three riders disappeared into the white darkness. Hours passed. Snow lashed against their faces so hard it felt like knives. Ayanna rode ahead, searching not for clear tracks, but for disturbances, pressed snow-broken brush, unnatural silence. Then she saw the crows. Flying low, circling. "This way," she shouted. They found Ethan trapped inside a collapsed snow ditch beneath a rocky slope. His horse stood nearby, trembling violently. Ethan barely moved. "Ayanna," Cole warned as she climbed down into the frozen trench. She ignored him, her gloves pressed against Ethan's face, checking warmth and breathing. "He's alive." She wrapped blankets around him tightly and pressed heated stones from her saddle pack against his chest. "Pull steady," she yelled upward. Cole and Sam dragged Ethan upward with ropes while snow continued collapsing around them. By the time they returned to Bennett Ranch near dawn, Walter stood waiting outside in the storm. His face turned pale the moment he saw Ethan alive. Inside the house, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, while Ayanna treated his frostbitten leg near the fireplace. At one point, Ethan gripped Walter's sleeve weakly. "If she hadn't found me," his voice cracked, "I'd be dead." Walter said nothing. Then Ethan looked toward Ayanna through fever-heavy eyes. "Thank you, sister." The room went silent. Walter stared at his youngest son like he no longer recognized the world around him. Without another word, he walked out. Cole remained behind, watching Ayanna differently now. Not with pity, not with obligation, with respect. But Ayanna never treated Ethan's rescue like victory. Before sunrise fully touched the valley, she quietly returned alone to the worker's shack, exhausted enough that her hands trembled when no one was watching. The weeks afterward brought new problems. Ayanna discovered the creek water turning muddy and shallow. Broken grass near the banks suggested recent wagon movement upstream. Someone redirected part of the flow, she warned Cole. Walter dismissed her immediately. That creek has fed this ranch for 20 years. Ayanna pointed toward disturbed earth and fresh wheel marks. The snowmelt isn't moving naturally. Walter refused to listen. Several days later, dozens of cattle collapsed from contaminated water. The loss stunned the entire ranch. Cole remembered every warning she had given. Walter remembered too. But pride kept him silent. Meanwhile, trouble spread beyond the ranch. In Red Hollow, Edward Whitmore used every disaster as proof that Bennett Ranch had invited bad fortune by bringing Ayanna into the family. Clara listened at first with heartbreak, then with bitterness. If the ranch falls apart, Edward told her carefully, Cole will realize what he gave up. Soon after, fires began. One hay barn burned late at night. Then fences were cut along the southern valley. Cattle scattered across the hills. Every incident looked like poor management from inside the ranch itself. Rumors spread quickly through town. Bad spirit bride, Indian curse. Ayanna heard every whisper. Still she stayed. She worked longer hours than anyone else. She treated burned horses after the fire, repaired fences in freezing wind, helped recover lost cattle through snow-covered hills. Gradually, a few ranch hands stopped laughing. Sam Carter began teaching her advanced cattle routes. Noah Briggs, the quiet veteran cowboy, started greeting her each morning with a simple nod. To Ayanna, that nod mattered more than fake kindness ever could. One evening, while helping sort cattle records, Ayanna spoke quietly to Cole. "Your workers don't feel this ranch belongs to them." Cole frowned. "It belongs to Bennett Ranch." That's exactly the problem. She explained how men protected land differently when they felt respected instead of used. Share profits after winter, she suggested. Reward loyalty. Give workers responsibility over what they manage. Cole stared at her thoughtfully. "You've thought about this before. A person who grows up unwanted understands how much belonging matters." Later, Cole mentioned the idea during a meeting. Walter laughed openly. Ranch hands need wages and orders, nothing more. But another man remained interested. Victor Chen. The railroad investor watched Ayanna carefully after that. "You think workers stay loyal because they're respected?" he asked her later. "They stay because they're seen." Victor nodded slowly. Walter noticed the conversation immediately. And for the first time, he no longer viewed Ayanna as simple embarrassment. She had become dangerous. Clara arrived at Bennett Ranch shortly afterward under the excuse of visiting Ethan. She found Cole alone in the stables near sunset. "You don't have to keep doing this," she whispered. Cole kept brushing the horse quietly. "You could still fix everything. The town would welcome you back." Your father would forgive you. And what exactly would I be returning to our future? Cole finally faced her. A beautiful cage is still a cage, Clara. Tears filled her eyes. What does she have that I don't? Cole answered honestly. Ayanna sees truth even when it hurts her. You only see what you want to own. The words shattered something inside her. As Clara rode away from Bennett Ranch, she looked back once. Ayanna stood beside an injured horse beneath the fading winter light, while Cole watched her from across the yard with quiet admiration Clara had never received. And in that moment, heartbreak turned into obsession. Before dawn touched the mountains surrounding Bennett Ranch, gunshots shattered the frozen silence. The first blast echoed across the valley, hard enough to wake every ranch hand in the bunkhouse. Then came shouting, horses screaming, the sharp metallic ringing of the alarm bell being pulled again and again. Men burst from their beds half-dressed, grabbing rifles and boots, while snow whipped across the yard. A cowboy came racing through the north gate on horseback, panic written across his face. They took the herd, he shouted. More than 40 head from the north pasture, Cole Bennett was already pulling himself into the saddle before the man finished speaking. Which direction? East Canyon fresh hoof prints cut deep through the snow toward the rocky canyon lands beyond the valley. Within minutes, a pursuit team formed beside the barn. Noah Briggs checked ammunition calmly while Sam Carter tightened saddle straps. Ethan mounted beside Cole despite his still healing leg. Walter Bennett appeared last, angry, humiliated. This is an attack on Bennett Ranch, he growled. We end it today. Ayanna studied the trail silently while the others prepared. Something felt wrong immediately. The cattle tracks were too obvious, too clean, almost as if someone wanted them followed. The herd had also been driven far too fast for ordinary rustlers trying to avoid attention. And the route itself, straight into the narrow eastern canyon. She rode toward Cole quickly. This doesn't feel like cattle theft. Walter rolled his eyes. And what would you know about cattle war? Ayanna ignored him. They want you chasing them. Cole hesitated. Walter cut in before he could answer. We don't have time for ghost stories. The riders spurred forward. Ayanna stared toward the canyon in the distance, unease tightening in her chest, like a warning she couldn't silence. The deeper they rode into the rocky canyon lands, and the worse the feeling became. Ayanna noticed birds exploding from cliff edges too early. Hidden wagon marks beneath wet mud. Boot tracks near narrow ledges where no cattle should have passed. People had waited here, prepared here. She urged her horse forward beside Cole. The canyon walls are too narrow, she warned. If someone shoots from above, there's nowhere to move. Cole looked upward uneasily. Walter overheard and laughed harshly. Bennett men don't turn around because a native woman feels afraid. Several ranch hands exchanged uncertain looks, but followed Walter deeper into the canyon anyway. Snowmelt water rushed harder beneath the rocks, now turning the canyon floor slick and unstable. Then Ayanna saw it. A flash of metal high above the cliffs. Gun barrels. Down, she screamed. The first rifle shot exploded a heartbeat later. Chaos swallowed the canyon instantly. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls while horses reared violently in panic. Cattle stampeded through the narrow pass, crushing anything in their path. One cowboy was thrown from the saddle with blood exploding across his shoulder. Ethan nearly took a bullet through the chest while dragging the wounded man behind cover. Noah Briggs barked orders while firing upward toward the cliffs. Spread out. Don't bunch together. But there was nowhere to spread. The canyon trapped them perfectly. Cole fought desperately to hold the riders together as gunfire rained from above. Walter still refused retreat. Push forward, he roared. Don't let them escape. Then the explosion came. A thunderous crack ripped through the canyon wall as part of the cliff collapsed into the rushing water below. Snowmelt burst through the shattered rocks in a violent flood. The ground beneath Walter's horse gave way. The animal screamed and slipped sideways. Walter crashed into the icy torrent below. Father Cole shouted. The current slammed Walter against rocks before pinning him beneath a fallen tree near the center of the flood. Cole tried to reach him immediately, but Noah grabbed his arm hard. "You go in there and you die too." Walter struggled helplessly as water surged around him. The rustlers retreated above, disappearing into the storm while the canyon descended into pure survival. Ayanna stared downstream only a moment before wheeling her horse sharply. Cole saw her moving. Ayanna wait, but she was already gone into the blinding snow and spray. Night fell quickly as the storm returned. The mountains vanished behind walls of wind and ice, while Ayanna followed the roaring river through narrow rock passages below the canyon. Bloodstains marked several stones along the bank. Walter had been dragged farther downstream. She finally found him trapped beneath a fallen cottonwood near the edge of a frozen ravine. One leg bent unnaturally beneath the current. Walter barely looked conscious. When he recognized her through the darkness, bitter laughter escaped his lips. "You should have left me there." Ayanna said nothing. She tied a rope around his chest and anchored the other end to her saddle horn. The freezing water numbed her hands almost instantly as she fought against the current. Walter was too heavy. Twice she nearly lost her footing completely. Finally, she managed to drag him onto a narrow patch of stone beside the riverbank. She built a fire beneath the shelter of the rocks, while snow swirled overhead. Walter drifted in and out of fevered consciousness. And in that half-delirious state, the truth began spilling from him. The valley belonged to them first, he muttered weakly. Ayanna froze. Walter stared into the flames without really seeing them. "We burned camps near Black Creek, drove families out before winter." His breathing shook painfully. Army wanted the land cleared fast. Ayanna's chest tightened. "You helped them," she whispered. Walter closed his eyes. Everyone did. Hours passed while she kept him alive. She forced him awake repeatedly. "Stay with me." Walter coughed weakly. "Why?" "Because dying doesn't erase what you've done." Near midnight, distant lantern lights finally appeared through the storm. Cole and the search riders found them beside the riverbank. The entire ranch witnessed the sight that followed. Ayanna kneeling beside the man who hated her most, and Walter Bennett alive, only because she refused to let him die. Walter's injuries forced him into bed for weeks inside the main house. Margaret stayed overwhelmed, caring for the wounded ranch hands, after the ambush, leaving Ayanna handling most of Walter's bandages herself. At first, he recoiled every time she touched him, but pain eventually stripped pride away. Day after day, he watched her move through the ranch tirelessly. She repaired saddles after midnight, treated injured horses, cooked for exhausted workers, slept barely a few hours before beginning again. Nothing about her matched the monster Red Hollow had invented. One night, while she changed the bandages around his leg, Walter finally spoke. "Why save me?" Ayanna tightened the cloth carefully before answering. "Because if I left you to die," she met his eyes steadily, "I would become exactly what men like you always believed my people were." Walter stared at her in silence long after she left the room. For the first time in decades, certainty began cracking inside him. Several nights later, Ayanna entered the old barn office, searching for more pain medicine. While opening drawers beneath a dusty cabinet, she noticed one lock already broken. Inside rested stacks of old papers tied with faded string. Land maps, government contracts, railroad agreements, letters carrying Walter Bennett's signature beside territorial officials. Ayanna unfolded one slowly, then stopped breathing. Red Elk, her father's name. Hands trembling violently, she continued reading. The documents described forced removals of Lakota camps from Northern Valley years earlier. Families labeled hostile occupants. Armed removals authorized near Black Creek. One report mentioned casualties during resistance. Among the dead, Thomas Red Elk. Ayanna dropped the papers onto the floor. The walls around her suddenly felt too small to breathe inside. Bennett Ranch had not simply been built on Lakota land. It had been built over her family's blood. She carried the documents back to the workers' shack and sat awake until dawn, staring at them beside the lantern light. Everything she had begun building with Cole now stood on top of something terrible. When she finally showed him the papers the next morning, Cole refused to believe them at first. Then he saw Walter's signature, the official seals, the reports. His face drained of color page by page. "No," he whispered. He reached the report describing her father's death and staggered backward like he'd been struck physically. Cole grabbed the oil lamp from the desk and hurled it against the wall. Glass exploded across the floor. He gathered the papers wildly. "I'll burn them." Ayanna caught his arm. "If this gets out," Cole said hoarsely, "everything dies. The ranch, my family, all of it." "The truth already exists," she replied quietly. Cole's eyes filled with tears. "How am I supposed to live knowing my family built everything on this?" Ayanna's own voice shook with pain. "If we bury it again, then we become the same people who caused it." Cole broke then. For the first time since she met him, he cried openly in front of her. And she held him despite carrying wounds just as deep. While Bennett Ranch fractured from the inside, Victor Chen and the railroad investors arrived in Red Hollow to finalize expansion contracts for Northern Valley. Walter demanded silence until the agreements were signed. If this scandal erupts now, he warned desperately, the investors pull out. The ranch hands lose work. The whole town collapses. For the first time in his life, Walter Bennett begged his son, "Don't destroy everything because of old ghosts." Cole wavered painfully between protecting the future and exposing the truth. But Ayanna already understood something clearly. If they signed new contracts on stolen land, the cycle would simply continue. The truth had to come first. Meanwhile, Clara Whitmore uncovered a truth of her own. One evening, she overheard Edward meeting several strangers behind an old storage warehouse near town. Hidden in the shadows, she listened in horror. Edward had hired the rustlers, the fires, the sabotaged fences, the cattle attacks, everything. He planned to weaken Bennett Ranch until Northern Valley could be bought cheaply through rival investors. And worse, he had spread every rumor about Ayanna being cursed to fuel hatred throughout Red Hollow. Clara felt sick. All this time she had blamed Ayanna for ruining her future. But greed and pride had destroyed far more than one engagement. Before dawn, Clara stole letters, payment receipts, and land contracts from Edward's office. Evidence strong enough to destroy him. The day of the Northern Valley signing arrived beneath a gray winter sky. Red Hollow Hall overflowed with ranch owners, bankers, investors, and townspeople, packed shoulder to shoulder. Walter entered leaning heavily on a cane, his face pale but composed. Victor Chen prepared the contracts at the center table. Then the hall doors opened. Ayanna stepped inside, carrying the old documents. The room fell silent immediately. Walter's expression collapsed. "No," he whispered. Ayanna walked to the center of the hall. Walter slammed his cane against the floor. "Stop this." But she didn't. Her voice rang across the room, steady and clear. These lands belonged to Lakota families before Bennett Ranch existed. Murmurs exploded instantly. She laid the documents before the investors one by one. Forced removals, military cooperation, burned camps, the death of her father. The hall erupted into chaos. Land thief, murderer, fraud. Some men shouted at Walter. Others screamed at Ayanna. One ranch owner pointed toward her furiously. Throw her out. Then Cole Bennett stepped beside her. If anyone here wants to condemn someone for speaking truth, he said loudly, start with me. The room quieted slightly. For the first time publicly, completely Cole chose Ayanna over his family legacy. Then another voice broke through the chaos. Sheriff Clara entered carrying Edward's stolen documents. Her hands shook violently as she handed them over. He hired the rustlers, she said. All of it. Edward lunged forward immediately. You stupid girl, the sheriff cut him off after checking the signatures. Within minutes, deputies dragged Edward Whitmore into handcuffs, while townspeople shouted in disbelief. Before being forced outside, Edward screamed toward Ayanna. This all started because of that native woman. But this time, nobody listened. Clara stood trembling near the doorway, watching her father taken away. Across the room, Ayanna met her eyes, not with triumph, with understanding. After nearly an hour of chaos, investors began gathering their papers to leave. Bennett Ranch is finished, one muttered. Victor Chen remained seated silently. Finally, he stood. A ranch built on lies is not worth investing in, he said calmly. The room quieted again. But a ranch willing to face truth in front of an entire town. He looked toward Ayanna and Cole. That is different. Shock rippled through the hall. Victor announced he would keep his investment. Under conditions. Part of Northern Valley would return to Lakota families. Future agreements would remain transparent, and Ayanna and Cole would jointly oversee the expansion. Walter closed his eyes heavily as the balance of power in Red Hollow shifted forever. Late that night, after the crowd disappeared, Walter sat alone inside the empty hall. Cole returned quietly. For once, Walter held no anger left, only exhaustion. I spent my whole life believing strength was the only thing that kept a man alive out here, Walter admitted weakly. He stared at his trembling hands. If I didn't take the land, someone else would have. His voice cracked. So I called your people savages, he told Ayanna softly after she entered behind Cole, because it was easier than admitting what I'd done. Tears finally filled the old man's eyes. The woman with every reason to hate me. He looked directly at her. Saved my life. Walter Bennett cried openly for the first time his son had ever seen. I built this ranch with fear, he whispered, and the two of you are trying to rebuild it with truth. Cole could not forgive him yet. Not fully. But for the first time in his life, he no longer saw his father as an untouchable monument, only a flawed man standing in the ruins of his own choices. Outside, Red Hollow remained awake deep into the night. Rumors spread like wildfire. Bennett Ranch stood closer to collapse than ever before. Yet for the first time since its foundation, the truth beneath it had finally been dragged into the light. Walter Bennett disappeared for 3 days after the truth exploded across Red Hollow Hall. No one knew where he went. Some believed he had ridden east to escape the shame swallowing his name. Others whispered he was drinking himself to death somewhere beyond the rail camps. Even Cole did not know. Then on the 4th morning, a lone rider appeared near the Lakota settlement north of Black Creek. Walter rode without ranch hands, without guards, without the silver-handled revolver he had carried for most of his life. Snow from the previous night still clung to the ground in thin patches as Lakota families stepped from cabins and tents to watch him approach with cold, guarded eyes. The moment several elders recognized him, anger spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. One man moved forward immediately. "You shouldn't be here." Walter dismounted slowly. Then he removed his gun belt and laid it on the frozen ground between them. The movement silenced the camp. "I didn't come to bargain," Walter said quietly. No one answered. He swallowed hard. "I came to apologize." The words sounded almost unnatural coming from him. Walter Bennett had spent decades commanding rooms, intimidating rivals, and forcing entire communities to bend beneath his will. But standing there before the people he had harmed, he suddenly looked like an old man carrying the weight of every year behind him. "I spent most of my life believing strength gave me the right to take whatever I wanted," he admitted. "Land, water, opportunity." His eyes lowered. "I called your people obstacles because it was easier than admitting I was afraid of losing what I built." A long silence followed. Then one elder stepped forward slowly. "You think apologies erase blood?" Walter's jaw tightened painfully. "No," he answered honestly. "But maybe the children after us deserve something better than the hatred we left them." For the first time in his life, Walter Bennett truly faced the human cost of his ambition. A week later, official papers were signed returning part of Northern Valley to Lakota families. The decision shook the entire region. Several ranch owners openly condemned Bennett Ranch, calling the agreement dangerous and weak. Some warned other land claims would follow. Walter listened to every accusation in silence. Victor Chen stood beside him publicly anyway. "The future of Wyoming cannot survive on buried wars forever," Victor said during the meeting. "Communities either learn to build together or they collapse separately." Ayanna proposed something few expected. The returned land would not become a separated territory, isolated from the ranchers. Instead, it would become shared ground. Lakota families could raise horses, work cattle routes, track storms through the mountain passes, and share profits from the expanding trade lines. Cole agreed immediately. Walter signed the papers last. His hands trembled slightly as the pen moved across the page. For years, every signature he gave had taken something. Land, power, control. This was the first one that gave something back. And strangely, it felt lighter. Bennett Ranch began changing faster than anyone imagined. Under Ayanna and Cole's leadership, the ranch transformed from a place ruled by fear into something entirely different. Seasonal profits were shared with workers. Cowboys who stayed through brutal winters earned bonuses and permanent cabins for their families. Funds were created for injured ranch hands and widows. Lakota trackers and horse healers were hired openly for the first time and paid fairly instead of secretly under the table. Skills once mocked by Red Hollow suddenly became valuable. Lakota riders could predict storms faster than most ranchers. They guided cattle safely through mountain passes where others got lost. They healed injured horses many thought beyond saving. Even the older cowboys who resisted change could not argue with results. The ranch ran smoother than ever before. Ayanna also pushed for women to help manage parts of ranch operations. Inventory, horse breeding records, supply accounting. At first, several older ranch hands laughed openly at the idea. Until the books became more organized, supplies stopped disappearing, and winter losses dropped dramatically. One evening during supper, Sam Carter finally leaned back in his chair and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This ranch survived last winter because of her." No one argued. Noah Briggs began openly supporting Ayanna during major ranch decisions. Ethan followed her constantly whenever he could, learning everything from weather patterns to cattle movement. Slowly, the names people used for her changed too. At first, they called her Mrs. Bennett awkwardly. Then, eventually just Ayanna. And somehow, that meant more. Because it no longer sounded forced. It sounded like she belonged there. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family collapsed completely after Edward's arrest. Their house was seized. Their accounts vanished. The same town that once praised them now avoided even speaking their name. One rainy afternoon, Clara and her mother arrived at Bennett Ranch, carrying only 2 small bags between them. Clara barely resembled the woman who once stood proudly inside Red Hollow Hall wearing silk gloves and pearl necklaces. Her dress was plain now. Her hands shook slightly as she faced Ayanna near the supply barn. "We need work," Clara said quietly. Several ranch hands muttered angrily nearby. She ought to be thrown out after everything. But Ayanna lifted a hand gently. "No." Clara stared at her in confusion. Ayanna offered them work in the kitchen laundry house and supply storage rooms. No revenge, no humiliation, only a chance. That confused Clara more than cruelty would have. Over the following weeks, her hands blistered from washing clothes and hauling water buckets. Her back ached from long hours cleaning floors and preparing meals for workers. For the first time in her sheltered life, she understood exhaustion. Real exhaustion. One night, she sat outside the laundry house crying quietly while staring at her cracked hands. Ayanna approached silently and sat beside her. Clara wiped her face quickly. "I used to think you stole my life." Ayanna said nothing. Clara laughed bitterly through tears. "But the truth is," she looked down at her ruined hands, "you were just brave enough to live the life I never had the courage to choose." The hatred between them finally began to fade after that night. Walter changed too, perhaps more than anyone. Once strong enough to walk again, he stopped hiding inside the office, barking orders from behind heavy wooden desks. Instead, ranch hands found him repairing fences, feeding horses, and checking water routes alongside everyone else. The first time a young cowboy nervously called him Sir Walter shook his head. "My name's Walter." The boy looked stunned. Walter spent more time with Ethan than he ever had before, listening instead of lecturing. Most surprising of all, he began listening to Ayanna. Really listening. One evening, while sitting near the fire, Walter admitted quietly, "I used to think strength meant making people fear you." Ayanna watched the flames for a moment before answering. "No. Real strength is when people still choose to follow you, even when they're free to walk away." Walter looked around the campfire. Ranch hands laughed together nearby, while Lakota riders shared coffee with cowboys who once refused to even sit beside them. For the first time, he realized Bennett Ranch had never truly been a family under his leadership. Only now was it becoming a community. Months later, Victor Chen returned to Red Hollow with new investors. This time they saw something entirely different from the divided ranch town they once visited. Native workers rode beside ranch hands naturally. Cattle routes operated more efficiently than ever. Worker turnover had dropped sharply. The ranch was growing stronger instead of weaker after the scandal. Victor smiled while reviewing the new contracts. Bennett Ranch may become the most modern ranch operation in Wyoming. The Northern Valley Expansion Agreement was officially signed that afternoon. New cattle routes, expanded horse breeding, transportation contracts, and beside Cole Bennett's signature, Ayanna Red Elk Bennett. For the first time in Red Hollow's history, a Native woman signed a major economic agreement beside the wealthiest ranchers in the territory. No one in town looked at her as an outsider anymore. Now they looked at her as part of Wyoming's future. Then summer brought fire. A lightning strike hit the northern grasslands during the driest season Red Hollow had seen in years. The flames spread with terrifying speed. Within hours, the entire valley glowed red beneath walls of smoke. Panic exploded across Northern Valley. If the fire crossed the eastern ridge, Red Hollow itself would burn. Alarm bells rang across Bennett Ranch as smoke swallowed the sky. Walter and several ranch hands became trapped inside the Northern Horse Barn when part of the roof collapsed into flames. Some people began fleeing immediately, but Ayanna took control before fear could destroy everything. Water lines here moved the cattle south, cut the grass before the ridge. Her voice carried through smoke and chaos while riders raced in every direction. She studied the wind carefully, the dryness of the grass, the terrain, then pointed toward a stretch of open field. "We burn there." Several ranchers stared at her in disbelief. "You want to start another fire?" "If we don't cut the fire now," she shouted back, "we lose everything." Cole trusted her instantly. Within minutes, controlled fire breaks began burning across the valley, while ranch hands and Lakota riders worked side by side, digging trenches and hauling water. Meanwhile, Cole led a group directly into the burning North Barn to free trapped horses. Ethan evacuated families and children toward the creek. Northern Valley became a battlefield between humanity and flame. Then came the scream. A mother realized her little boy was still trapped near the collapsing stable. Nobody moved. The fire had become too dangerous. The roof groaned overhead seconds from collapse. Walter saw the child through the smoke. Without hesitation, he ran straight into the flames. Walter Cole shouted. Inside, terrified horses kicked wildly while burning beams crashed around him. Walter found the boy trapped beneath an overturned water trough near the back wall. He dragged the child free just as flaming timber collapsed from above. Walter threw his own body over the boy to shield him. Outside, Ayanna and Cole watched in horror as the stable began collapsing entirely. Then through the smoke, Walter emerged, carrying the child. The barn collapsed seconds behind him in an explosion of sparks and fire. He staggered only a few more steps before falling heavily to the ground. Badly burned, barely conscious. Ayanna dropped beside him immediately. Walter grabbed her hand weakly before losing consciousness. "You saved the soul of this ranch," he whispered. For the first time, there was no hesitation in his voice, no resistance. Only truth. The fire breaks finally stopped the flames before dawn. Then rain came. Heavy, cold rain pouring across Northern Valley, while exhausted riders collapsed into the mud around smoking fields. Red Hollow survived. And standing there among the ashes, townspeople saw something none of them would have believed possible only a year earlier. Lakota riders, cowboys, ranch hands, families, all helping one another survive. Victor Chen stood beside Cole, watching the valley slowly cool beneath the rain. "This," he said quietly, "is the real future of Wyoming." Even ranch owners who once mocked Ayanna publicly thanked her now. But for Ayanna, the most important thing wasn't the gratitude. It was seeing people who once feared each other standing together instead of apart. Several months later, Walter called every ranch hand to gather outside the main house. The entire valley stood beneath a cold autumn sky, while Walter stepped forward carrying official documents. His voice remained rough from smoke damage. Ayanna Red Elk Bennett, he announced, is now part owner of Bennett Ranch. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Walter looked directly at the workers. "She didn't save this ranch with guns." His eyes shifted toward Ayanna proudly. "She saved it by teaching us how to become better people." Ethan cheered first. Then Sam Carter began clapping. Noah Briggs followed. Soon the entire ranch joined in. From that day forward, Ayanna's name appeared on cattle contracts, Northern Valley agreements, and eventually even the new wooden sign standing at the ranch entrance. The woman once called the native woman no one wanted had become the person Red Hollow respected most. And perhaps the clearest sign of change came quietly. Lakota children and ranchers' children now played together beside Black Creek, where division once ruled. Things that once seemed impossible slowly became ordinary. Late one autumn afternoon, Ayanna stood on a hill overlooking Bennett Ranch. Below her stretched the transformed valley. New horse barns, windmills, grazing cattle, Lakota cabins standing beside ranch houses instead of separated from them. Children laughed near the creek, where two worlds once refused to meet. Cole walked up beside her quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled softly. This town was too blind to see your worth. Ayanna looked across the valley as memories moved through her mind. The freezing worker shack, the mocking laughter, the hateful stares inside Red Hollow Hall. The days when the entire town called her the woman no one wanted. And now, that same land spoke her name with respect. Cole turned toward her gently. Do you still feel like an outsider? Ayanna stared at the valley a long time before answering. No. A small smile touched her face as wind rolled softly across the Wyoming hills. For the first time in my life, she whispered, I finally feel like I belong here. Together they stood watching the sunset spread across Bennett Ranch, a land once built on fear, now held together by truth, courage, and the difficult choice to forgive. For me, the most powerful message in this story is not just about love or forgiveness. It's about how easily people judge someone they never truly try to understand. Ayanna was rejected, mocked, and treated like she didn't belong long before anyone cared to see her heart, her strength, or her wisdom. And honestly, I think that happens in real life more often than we admit. Sometimes the people society overlooks are the very ones holding everything together in silence. This story reminds me that real value is not always loud, rich, or respected at first glance. Sometimes it's hidden inside the people the world almost refuses to see. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story and supporting the channel. Your comments, likes, and kind words truly mean the world to us. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next unforgettable story.